The Kithar Dominion patrol cruiser. Spear of Dominion emerged from shift. Space with a growl of tortured reality. Its sensor spines already clawing at the void. Commander Verk stood on the command. Promontory, his four-jointed fingers. Laced behind his back, the pale fur. Along his neck bristling with the satisfaction of a clean translation. A target had materialized exactly where. Long-range scans predicted, alone. Vessel unshielded bleeding thermal. Radiation like a wounded animal. Designation, Verk said, his voice a dry rustle. Unknown configuration, no Dominion, no. Alliance markers, mass suggests a light. Exploration craft, armaments none. Detectable. Verk's amber eyes narrowed. A species that sent unarmed ships into disputed corridors was either impossibly naive or suicidally overconfident. He decided it was the former. Boarding protocol. Secure the vessel, capture any command personnel for interrogation, kill the rest. The assault shuttles detached like seed pods, their hulls drinking ambient light. They latched onto the human ship's hull, with magnetic grapples cutting through the thin alloy with plasma torches that made the metal sag and weep. Inside the Endeavor, atmosphere bled into the cold gap between hulls, and the Kithar borders poured through. Verk watched the helmet feeds on the main display, corridors too narrow, ceilings too low, the enemy crew. Bipedal, soft-skinned, clad in simple fabric, moved to intercept with nothing but hand tools and desperation. A human swung a length of pipe at a Kithar soldier. The soldier absorbed the blow on his carapace armor and bisected the human with a single horizontal cut. Another human lunged, screaming, and was pinned to a bulkhead by a spike of superheated alloy. The slaughter took 3 minutes. No human reached for a weapon that mattered. Commander, one survivor stunned. Female, apparent command authority. Verk felt a ripple of contempt. Bring her aboard, have the medical section. Prep the interrogation suite. I want her conscious and terrified within the hour. When they dragged Captain Myra Vance onto the Spear of Dominion, Verk studied her with the detached curiosity of a xenobiologist examining a specimen. She was small by Kithar standards, perhaps 1.8 m, with dark hair matted by sweat, and a thin trail of blood from a scalp wound. Her uniform was torn at the shoulder, revealing flesh that looked as durable as wet paper. No chitin, no armored ridges. Her eyes, however, were wrong. They were pale gray, and they tracked movement with a liquid precision that suggested that neither shock nor despair. She catalogued the guards, the corridor, the flicker of the light strips. Verk recognized the look. It was the look of something that intended to survive. He stepped closer, his boots clicking on the deck plates. I am Commander Verk of the Kithar Dominion. Your vessel was trespassing in sovereign space. Your crew resisted. They are dead. You will provide information on your species, military capabilities, colonization, extent, and homeworld coordinates. Cooperation will make your remaining existence less painful. Myra Vance lifted her head. Her voice came out dry but steady. Sovereign space, we were 12 light years from your nearest border buoy. You butchered a science crew because you could. That was your opening move. Verk's ear tufts flicked. You are in no position to lecture me on diplomatic protocol. Your species has no recognized claim, no fleet, no deterrent. You are insects beneath our notice. The human woman smiled, and the expression was a split seam across her face. No warmth, no humor, just a hard, knowing edge that Verk's instincts failed to categorize. Commander, you really should have let us keep drifting. He turned away, irritated by her defiance. Take her to interrogation. Soften her up. I want full neural maps. Within 2 cycles. As the guards hauled her away, Myra Vance looked back over her shoulder, and, for the span of a single heartbeat, Verk felt a sensation he had not experienced since his larval molt, the cold whisper of something ancient telling him to run. He crushed the feeling beneath professional discipline and began drafting a preliminary report to High Command, classifying the new species as a pre-contact civilization of negligible threat. The report never reached its intended recipients in the form he expected, because 8 hours later, while the interrogators were still setting up their equipment, the human prisoner started talking unprompted, and everything Verk believed about the galaxy began to crack. Part 2. The interrogation chamber was a sphere of sterile white ceramic, its single chair anchored to the floor with molecular bonding strips that held the prisoner's wrists, ankles, and torso. Immobile, Myra Vance sat motionless, her breathing slow as a Kithar neural specialist calibrated the pain inducer array that would map her central nervous system through systematic agony. Commander Verk observed from an observation balcony, a junior analyst named Thoric at his side. She hasn't pleaded, Thoric murmured. They always plead by now. She doesn't understand what's coming, Varric said. But when the specialist activated the first low-level pulse, enough to make a Kithar warrior howl, Myra Vance didn't scream. Her fingers curled against the restraints, her jaw tightened until the tendons stood out like cables, and then she did something that made the specialist hesitate. She laughed. It was a breathless, ragged sound, utterly incongruous. You can skip the warm-up, she said, voice strained but clear. I've had kidney stones that hurt more. If you're going to torture me, you'll need to try much harder, but before you do, I want you to understand something. Varric leaned forward and keyed the intercom. Speak then, offer something useful. Myra tilted her head, the motion bird-like. You're a commander. That means you've studied military history. At least your own species' version of it. Tell me, what's the worst mistake a civilization can make when encountering an unknown power? Varric's ear tufts flattened. Underestimating their technology. Wrong, it's poking something you don't understand and assuming it won't poke back harder. She let that sit for a moment. That ship you destroyed, it was a survey vessel, unarmed, full of geologists and biologists who just wanted to look at some pretty nebulas. They had families, they had children, and you killed them because you could. The specialist adjusted the inducer controls, sending a sharper current through the restraints. Myra's body arched involuntarily, strangled gasp escaping her lips. But when the pulse ended, she was still smiling, tears of pain streaming from the corners of her eyes but not obscuring the intensity behind them. You're going to send a demand for Earth surrender, she continued, panting. That's standard Dominion protocol. Then you'll wait for a reply. She paused, swallowing hard. Let me give you the reply in advance. Varric stiffened. Outside, the communications officer was already preparing the declaration, a broadcast on all channels laced with footage of the Endeavor's destruction, demanding total capitulation within one rotation. Dominion procedure was ironclad: fear the new species into submission before they could organize. It had worked on 7 civilizations before. Myra Vance locked eyes with the observation window as if she could see directly through the one-way ceramic. "Congratulations," she said, "you just started a war with the deadliest species in the galaxy." The declaration went out 12 minutes later, beamed toward the blue-white dot that human star charts called Sol. Verac ordered the prisoner sedated because something in her unwavering stare was interfering with his sleep cycles. He told himself it was bluster, the desperate bravado of a cornered animal. But when the sedative took hold and Myra Vance's eyes finally closed, the silence she left behind was heavier than the threat she'd spoken. Thalric, the junior analyst, kept glancing at the neural readings from the interrogation as if they contained a cipher he was afraid to decode. 12 hours after the broadcast, the Spear of Dominion received a transmission from Earth. No diplomat's face appeared. No negotiation was offered. The message consisted of a single data packet, a set of orbital coordinates and a countdown timer set to 900 seconds. Verac called up the coordinates on the tactical display. They pinpointed Dominion Outpost 7, a fortified moon base on the outer edge of a resource-rich gas giant in a system 3 light-years from his current position. A garrison of 800 HFY soldiers, planetary defense batteries, shield generators rated for coronal mass ejections. "What is this?" Verac muttered. The timer ticked down. 600 seconds, 360. 0. On the long-range display, Outpost 7 vanished. There was no energy beam, no missile trace, no warhead signature. 1 moment the moon was there, a solid sphere of rock and military infrastructure. The next it was an expanding cloud of debris and vaporized alloy. Sensors scrambled to reconstruct the event and found the answer buried. The aftershock data, a solid tungsten rod massing several thousand tons, had struck the moon at just under 0.7 light speed. The impact released kinetic energy equivalent to 100 fusion warheads. Nothing survived. The command deck of the Spear of Dominion fell into a brittle stillness that no word in the HFY lexicon could adequately name. Verac stared at the empty sensor plot where 800 of his people had been, and for the first time in his 40-cycle career, he felt the floor tilt beneath him, not physically, but existentially. The humans hadn't sent a fleet. They sent a rock thrown so fast that physics itself became an executioner. From somewhere deep in the ship, he imagined he could hear Myra Vance's voice, though she was still sedated and silent. The words replayed in his skull. Mocking and prophetic, he reached for the command console, fingers trembling, to open a priority channel to high command. Before he could speak, the tactical officer reported an energy spike, multiple translation signatures, inbound and closing fast. Part 3. The human prisoner opened her eyes 30 seconds before the alarms began. Myra Vance had been feigning sedation for the better part of 3 hours, her metabolism burning through the chemical fog with an efficiency that would have terrified the Kithar medical staff had they been monitoring her properly. She lay still, cataloging the guard rotations through slitted lids, counting the intervals between corridor patrols, and waiting for the moment she knew was coming. The relativistic strike on Outpost 7 was Earth's opening statement. Myra had known it would arrive precisely as it did because she'd spent her career studying the doctrinal response protocols of the United Terran Navy. Standard escalation ladder, a single kinetic warning shot delivered with mathematical precision, timed to coincide with the enemy's receipt of the surrender demand. Humanity didn't negotiate with murderers. Humanity demonstrated consequences. She felt the ship shudder as the translation signatures of the human task force rippled through local space-time. The overhead lights flickered. Distant shouting echoed through the hull. Kithar voices stripped of their earlier arrogance, now tight with something that sounded remarkably like fear. Myra allowed herself a small, cold smile. She had work to do. The restraint straps on her medical cot were designed for Kithar physiology, which meant they relied on broad pressure points across joints that bent differently than hers. She spent the sedated hours slowly hyperextending her left index finger against the strap's edge, applying incremental pressure until the proximal phalanx dislocated with a muted pop. The pain had been exquisite, a cleansing fire that burned away the last of the drug haze. She ignored it, used the slack in the loosened strap to free her hand, and then set about the grisly business of crafting a tool. With her freed hand, she found the dislocation point and wrenched the bone through the skin. Blood welled hot and dark, but she clamped down on the nerve responses. Through sheer will, the splinter of her own bone, sharp and roughly triangular, became a pick. She worked it into the molecular bonding strip's control panel, a simple magnetic lock interface meant to be operated by Kithar claw tips, and shorted the circuit. The restraints hissed open. Myra stood, cradling her ruined hand, and took stock of the medical bay. Tray of surgical implements, a sedative injector, and environmental control terminal. The ship was a Dominion cruiser built on the assumption that any threat would come from outside. Its internal security was laughably porous. She wrapped her hand in a torn strip of bedding and went to work. Outside in the black, the human battle group translated into real space with all the subtlety of a warhammer. The task force consisted of 4 ships, 2 destroyers, a heavy cruiser, and a single carrier that disgorged swarms of autonomous combat drones. Their hulls were not sleek or elegant. They were slabs of armor and weapon emplacements, bristling with magnetic accelerator cannons and cluster missile pods. They had no energy shields because human engineers had long ago determined that kinetic barriers could be defeated by firing faster kinetics. The solution to every problem was more velocity. Commander Verk watched the tactical display populate with threat vectors and felt his command training evaporate. Human electronic warfare protocols flooded Dominion communications with junk data, fractal noise patterns, recursive logic bombs, and something they technicians called a Turing ghost that was actively rewriting their fire control software in real time. Targeting systems locked onto phantom echoes. Missile tubes refused to open. The sphere of Dominion's vaunted particle lances, capable of bisecting a cruiser from 1,000 kilometers, couldn't acquire a lock because the human ships weren't where the sensors said they were. Return fire, Verk bellowed. All batteries, manual targeting, fire on anything that moves. A few gunners managed to unleash volleys of magnetically jacketed plasma bolts. One struck the human heavy cruiser, amidship splashing against its composite armor. The cruiser didn't even slow, it rotated on its axis, presenting a fresh battery face and answered with a salvo of solid slugs that punched through the sphere of Dominion's hull like needles through silk. Atmospheric breaches erupted across 15 decks. Crew were sucked into vacuum, their flailing forms freezing in the starlight. Verk clung to his command promontory as the ship bucked. "Report, where is they?" "Prisoner." The answer came not from his crew, but from the ship's intercom, which crackled to life with a voice he recognized. "Myra." Evan's tone was flat, almost conversational, with an undertone of something far more primal. "Commander Verk, I'm in your environmental control center. I've just vented the atmosphere from decks 4 through 9. That's medical, secondary engineering, and your main barracks. I estimate you've lost about 60% of your personnel in the last 3 minutes, not counting the ones the fleet is killing." Verk's blood turned to ice. "You are still aboard. You will die with us." "No," Myra said, and the word was not defiant, it was simply correct. "I'm going to walk out of here, but before I go, I want you to understand something. You called my people insects, but insects swarm, insects overwhelm. Insects don't stop until the threat is extinct. That's what you've invited into your territory. Congratulations, Commander, you just upgraded your species extinction probability by several orders of magnitude." The intercom cut out. On the tactical display, the human destroyers were methodically dismantling the Dominion escort screen. Verk opened his mouth to give an order, but no words came. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say to the void. Part 4. The interior of the Spear of Dominion had become an abattoir. Myra Vance moved through the maintenance corridors like a ghost wrapped in blood-soaked bandages, her improvised bone pick replaced by a Kithar plasma cutter she'd taken from a dead engineer. The weapon was heavy and ill-balanced for human hands, but she compensated with close-quarters brutality. She had stopped counting her kills at 12. It wasn't important. What mattered was the reactor. She studied Dominion ship schematics from the data cache she'd accessed in the Environmental Control Center. The fusion core was a toroidal design, stabilized by magnetic containment fields that were powerful but dependent on a single primary control trunk running the length of the engineering spine. If she could reach the trunk and introduce a cascading feedback loop, the core would destabilize in a way no safety system could counteract. The resulting explosion would vaporize everything within 10,000 km. The corridors were chaos. Kithar crews scrambled toward damage control stations, their natural herd instincts overriding tactical sense. Myra used their panic as cover, sliding through vent shafts and maintenance hatches, her wounded hand throbbing a steady drumbeat of pain that kept her senses sharp. She rounded a corner and found 3 Kithar soldiers guarding the engineering access hatch. They saw her simultaneously. She didn't hesitate. The plasma cutter lanced out, taking the first soldier through the throat before he could raise his weapon. The second lunged, all 4 arms swinging, and Myra ducked inside his reach, jamming the cutter's barrel up under his jaw plate and firing. The third soldier managed to get his sidearm up and put a bolt through her left shoulder. The impact spun her, searing flesh and cracking bone, but momentum carried her into a roll, and she came up with the cutter in her offhand, firing blind. Bolt caught the soldier in the lower abdomen and he folded. Myra staggered against the bulkhead, breathing in ragged gasps. The shoulder wound was bad. She could feel the heat of cauterized tissue and the grinding of broken bone, but it wasn't immediately fatal. She tore a strip from her uniform, bound it tight, and keyed the engineering hatch. It slid open on a cavern of humming machinery and flickering status displays. The primary control trunk was a column of bundled conduits rising through the center of the bay. She limped toward it. Cutter raised. Alarms began to warble as the human fleet outside delivered another punishing broadside. The deck pitched violently. Myra grabbed a support strut, swung herself toward the trunk, and began cutting into the access panel. Commander Verk, meanwhile, was fighting a losing battle on the bridge. His escort screen was gone, 2 frigates and a destroyer reduced to expanding debris fields. The Spear of Dominion was venting atmosphere from 100 wounds. His tactical officer was dead at her station. Thalric, the young analyst, was trying to coordinate damage control from a secondary console, his voice cracking with strain. Commander, multiple internal breaches. On the engineering deck, the prisoner. She's reached the reactor core. Vark's mind raced. If the core went critical, the flagship would be annihilated. His remaining crew would die. He would die. The only option was evacuation, but escape pods would be shredded by the human fleet's point defense guns unless he could create a diversion. He made a decision that tasted like ash. Order all hands to abandon ship. Priority override. I want every pod launched in the next 2 minutes. Divert all remaining power to forward shields. We're going to ram the human carrier. Thalric stared at him. Commander. That's an order, analyst. Execute. The Spear of Dominion lurched as its engines flared to maximum thrust, driving it directly toward the human battle group center mass point. Defense cannons opened up, chewing through the cruiser's hull, but they reinforced bow plowed forward. Escape pods burst from the flanks like seeds from a ruptured pod, scattering in all directions. In the engineering bay, Myra Vance finished her sabotage. The control trunk's failsafe protocols were overridden. The containment field was now receiving a false stability reading. The core would hold for approximately 4 minutes before the feedback loop cascaded into criticality. She turned and ran, ignoring the fire in her shoulder, sprinting for the nearest escape pod bay. She reached the pod bay just as the first shock waves of the ramming attempt rippled through the hull. A single pod remained, its hatch open. She dove inside, slammed the launch control, and felt the explosive bolts fire. The pod shot away from the Spear of Dominion, tumbling through the maelstrom of battle. Through the viewport, she watched the cruiser plow into the human carrier's forward shields, which flared brilliant white before collapsing. The 2 ships merged in a cataclysm of tearing metal and venting plasma. And then, 4 minutes later, the reactor let go. The explosion was silent and beautiful, a sphere of white light that consumed both vessels and a dozen nearby drones, expanding and then fading, leaving nothing but cooling plasma and the scattered remnants of Verk's command. Myra's pod was caught in the shock wave and flung outward, but its internal dampeners held. She floated in the darkness alone, watching the stars wheel past. Her lips moved, forming words that no one could hear. 37 crew, scientist friends. This was the opening of the door, nothing more. The human fleet, having lost its carrier but preserved its destroyers, began recovery operations. A shuttle locked onto Myra's pod within the hour. When they pulled her out, she was conscious, cradling her ruined hand in her bleeding shoulder, her gray eyes still carrying that terrible patient light. The medic who treated her would later say that she never once closed her eyes during the entire retrieval, as if she was still cataloging threats, still hunting. Commander Verk ejected in a command pod moments before the ramming impact watched the destruction of his flagship. From 100 km away, his pod's distress beacon was broadcasting on an open channel on the pod's small display. The human fleet was reforming its formation, already calculating the next jump coordinates. They weren't stopping, they were accelerating. Part 5. The Dominion High Command convened an emergency session within a bunker buried 30 km beneath the crust of Kythar Prime. The council chamber was a vast, vaulted space carved from living stone, its walls inscribed with the conquests of 1,000 cycles. Holographic projectors cast the faces of 27 planetary governors and military marshals around a central dais where Grand Marshal Zerash, eldest of the war council, stood with her fur bleached white by age and her eyes burning with scarcely contained fury. The footage from the Spear of Dominion's final transmissions played on a loop. The kinetic strike on Outpost 7, the human fleet's emergence, the carnage of the boarding action, now revealed to have been orchestrated by a single injured human who had turned the flagship's own systems against its crew. The final image of 2 capital ships annihilated in a fusion fireball. Zerash silenced the murmuring with a single raised talon. We have lost a cruiser, 3 escorts, a fortified garrison moon, and over 4,000 soldiers. The humans have lost 1 carrier, a vessel they apparently consider expendable. Their remaining forces are regrouping, and according to our intelligence, preparing to advance on our border colonies. We are no longer the hunters. In this scenario, Governor Melek of the Outer Territories, a pragmatist who had counseled against the initial interception, spoke with bitter precision. We initiated hostilities against an unarmed civilian vessel. The galactic community will view this as a provocation, not a defense, and the humans, by every metric we now possess, are not going to accept a ceasefire. Their military doctrine appears to be total commitment until the adversary's capacity for resistance is permanently broken. A younger marshal, his name plate identifying him as Relic, slammed a fist on his console. Then we commit our full fleet. We have 30 capital ships, 200 escorts, planetary defense networks on every colony. They have a handful of vessels and primitive kinetic weapons. We will crush them. The chamber fell silent as a new hologram flickered to life. It was a recorded transmission intercepted by a listening post on the fringe of human space. The face that appeared was not a diplomat or an admiral. It was Captain Myra Vance. Her uniform scorched her arm in a medical sling, her gray eyes fixed on the camera with an intensity That made several council members physically recoil. This message is for the leadership of the Kithar Dominion, she said. My name is Myra Vance. 2 standard weeks ago, you murdered the crew of the civilian survey vessel Endeavor. You tortured me. For information, you attempted to force Earth surrender. In response, we have demonstrated our willingness to escalate beyond your comprehension. But I want you to understand something about humanity that your intelligence briefings will never capture. She paused and a subtle shift occurred in her expression, not anger, not cruelty, but something older and far more unsettling, patience. The patience of a species that had evolved tracking prey across savannas until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. The patience of a predator that did not need to be faster or stronger, only more enduring. We are not the strongest species in the galaxy. We are not the most technologically advanced. We have no natural armor, no energy manipulation, no psionic abilities. What we have is a particular neurological quirk. When we identify a threat, our threat response does not disengage until the threat is neutralized, not pacified, not negotiated with, neutralized. This is not policy, it is biology. We are persistence hunters by evolutionary design, and we have turned that design into an industrial process. Myra leaned closer to the camera. You've killed our people. You've tried to kill me. That means every human alive now has a neurological imperative to ensure you can never do it again. Your colonies will burn, your fleet will be shattered, your home world will be blockaded, and we will not stop, we will never stop. Because the alternative, leaving a threat alive to harm us again, is something our brains literally cannot accept. The transmission ended. The council chamber remained completely still. The silence stretched for a full minute before Zarish spoke. She is bluffing, a psychological operation. She is not, Melik said quietly. I've analyzed the human combat logs. Their soldiers do not retreat. Their ships do not surrender when they take casualties. Their morale does not break. It intensifies. I've cross-referenced their biological data, their homeworlds, gravity, atmospheric pressure, temperature extremes, predator density. It exceeds Kithar Prime's danger index by a factor of 4. They evolved in an environment where stopping meant dying. We have awakened something we do not understand. Before anyone could respond, a priority alert screamed through the chamber. Systems, a panicked communications officer's voice cut in. Grand Marshal. Multiple translation signatures detected. At the Valaris colony, human ships 12. Capital-grade signatures, there. Launching projectiles at the planetary defense grid. Zarish watched the tactical feed as Valaris's orbital batteries, pride of the Dominion's outer defenses, began to wink out one after another. The humans weren't targeting cities. They were surgically dismantling military infrastructure, isolating the colony, and then the feed cut to static as a relay satellite was destroyed. The war had entered its next phase, and somewhere in the cold depths of interstellar space, a Kithar escape pod drifted with a single occupant. Commander Verk, sole survivor of his command, still alive because a human captain had chosen not to kill him. He stared at the emergency rations and the flickering distress beacon and understood with a clarity that bordered on revelation that being spared was not Mercy, it was a message, witness and remember, tell your people what you saw. Make sure they understand before it's too late. He began recording a personal log, his voice shaking. Part 6. The invasion of Valaris colony lasted 11 hours. The human fleet, now reinforced to 18 vessels, employed a strategy that Kithar military analysts would spend the next decade trying to deconstruct. There was no grand orbital bombardment, no theatrical ultimatum. Instead, the humans deployed clouds of kinetic harpoons, tungsten spikes no larger than a Kithar forearm, accelerated to fractional light velocities and aimed with surgical precision at communication arrays, power distribution nodes and shield generators. The planetary defense grid, designed to repel energy, weapon barrages and missile swarms, was incapable of intercepting thousands of relativistic projectiles that gave no warning before impact. Once the grid was blind and mute, the human ground forces arrived. They didn't use drop pods or assault shuttles that could be tracked. They used something far more terrifying, orbital insertion, via ablative ceramic shells that screamed through the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds, each shell containing a single human soldier in powered combat armor. The shells struck the surface like meteorites, digging craters in Kithar military installations, and the humans emerged from the wreckage already firing. The Kithar garrison commander at Valaris, a seasoned veteran named Jorath, transmitted a desperate report. Before his command bunker was breached. They don't fight like soldiers, they fight like a natural disaster. They don't take cover, they advance through fire. They don't retreat, they reposition and keep killing. I've watched a human with both legs blown off drag herself toward a munitions depot with a detonator in her teeth. This is not warfare, this is extermination with extra steps. Jorath's transmission ended with the sound of a breaching charge and a scream that cut off abruptly. Grand Marshal Zarish, watching from the Kithar Prime bunker, felt her centuries of military experience crumbling into irrelevance. The humans weren't trying to conquer Valaris, they were destroying its capacity to function as a military asset. Then moving on, they left the civilian population centers untouched, but the message was unmistakable. We can reach you anywhere, and we can remove your ability to fight without killing your non-combatants, but only if we choose to. The restraint was somehow more frightening than indiscriminate slaughter would have been. It suggested a level of control and discrimination that bordered on the inhuman. Commander Verk, still adrift in his escape pod, received a fragmented data burst from a passing Dominion scout vessel that had been dispatched to search for survivors. The scout's captain, a young officer named Thrax, transmitted the news from Valaris in a voice that cracked with disbelief. Commander, they're calling it the Valaris lesson on the civilian networks. The humans broadcast the entire operation real time, every installation destroyed, every garrison eliminated. They're not hiding what they're doing. They want us to watch. Verk closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against the pod's cold bulkhead. Myra Vance's words echoed in his memory. We are persistence hunters by evolutionary design, and we have turned that design into an industrial process. He finally understood that humans weren't fighting a war in the Kithar sense, a contest of strength that ended with negotiations and territorial adjustments. They were conducting a culling. They would keep destroying military targets, keep escalating, keep advancing, until the Dominion's will to resist was not merely broken, but erased from the species' collective psyche. Aboard the human flagship Resolute, now positioned in high orbit over Velaris's smoldering defense grid, Captain Myra Vance stood in the CIC with her wounded arm immobilized and her gray eyes fixed on the tactical hologlobe. Admiral Helena Rostova, a woman with a face like weathered granite and a voice like grinding tectonic plates, stood beside her. The Kithar are trying to open negotiations, Rostova said, not looking away from the display. They're offering a full ceasefire, reparations, territorial concessions, everything short of unconditional surrender. Myra didn't blink. Do they understand what unconditional surrender means yet? No, they think it's a starting point for bargaining. Their cultural framework doesn't include the concept of total capitulation without terms. They've never encountered an enemy who wasn't willing to compromise. Then we need to educate them further. Myra's voice was flat, clinical. Hit the Nexus shipyards next. That's their primary fleet construction facility. Remove their ability to replace losses, and the rest of their military calculus collapses. Rostova studied her for a long moment. You're aware that the psychological review board flagged you after your debriefing. They said you're exhibiting signs of post-traumatic hypervigilance. They recommended extended leave and counseling. Myra finally turned to meet the Admiral's gaze. Her expression was not angry, not defiant. It was serene in a way that was deeply wrong. Admiral, with respect, I watched 37 of my crewmates butchered because a Kithar commander was bored. I was tortured. I was told my species was beneath notice. The psychological review board can flag whatever it wants, but the truth is that I'm not hypervigilant. I'm calibrated. This is what humanity looks like when it's focused. This is what we become when someone gives us a reason. Rostova held her gaze, then nodded slowly. Then go calibrate the target package for Nexus. But Myra, when this is over, you're going to have to find a way to turn it off. The war won't last forever. No, Myra said, turning back to the hollow globe, but the memory of it will. That's the point. The Resolute's drives flared, and the fleet began its jump calculations for the Nexus system. In his escape pod, Verk received the updated fleet movement data and felt something inside him finally break. He opened a channel to the scout vessel and made a request that no Kithar commander had ever made before, a direct line to the human flagship. He wanted to speak to Myra Vance. The scout captain hesitated, then complied. The channel opened, static hissed, and then a voice. Commander Verk, I wondered when you'd call. Part 7. The channel between Verk's escape pod and the Resolute crackled with the sound of distant stars. Myra Vance's voice came through clear, unhurried, utterly devoid of triumph. You want to negotiate, she said. It wasn't a question. Verk's throat was dry. His translator struggled to find equivalents for concepts his language had never needed to express. I want to understand what you require. For this to stop, your fleet is moving toward Nexus. Those shipyards employ 40,000 civilians. The orbital habitats around the construction docks contain Families. If you destroy them. If we destroy them, Myra interrupted. Those 40,000 civilians will have died. Because the Kithar Dominion initiated an unprovoked attack on a civilian survey vessel, the chain of causality is clear. We didn't start this, we're just finishing it. Verk felt his claws clench. Involuntarily. You can't hold an entire species responsible for the actions of one. Commander, I gave the order to board the Endeavor. I authorized the interrogation. Punish me, execute me, but spare the shipyards. A long pause. When Myra spoke again, her voice had shifted, still hard but with a layer of something that might have been exhaustion. Commander, do you know what happened to the last species that tried to exterminate humanity? There are no records of such a species. Exactly. There are no records because we erased them, not their cities. We erased their existence from the galactic fossil record. We didn't do it out of hatred. We did it because after a certain threshold of provocation, our threat response doesn't differentiate between guilty and complicit. It just sees a pattern of danger and removes it. Verk shuddered. You're describing genocide. I'm describing self-defense at the species level, and I'm telling you that we've spent the last 3 centuries trying very hard not to let that part of ourselves off the leash again. We built treaties, we created oversight councils, we condition our soldiers to de-escalate, to negotiate, to find paths other than annihilation. Her voice caught just slightly. And then you killed 37 of my friends. You strapped me to a chair and tried to torture information out of me. And I'm standing here looking at the target package for Nexus, and do you know what terrifies me, Commander? Verk couldn't speak. What terrifies me is that the part of me that wants to burn your shipyards to ash isn't the wounded part, it's the cold part, the rational part, the part that calculated the probability of future Kithar aggression and decided that a dead shipyard is a safe shipyard. That's what we are. We're not monsters. Monsters feel something when they kill. We've gotten very, very good at making it feel like arithmetic. The silence stretched. Verk stared at the comm panel, his reflection ghostly in the dark screen. I can't offer you unconditional surrender, he said finally. The High Command won't accept it. They'll fight to the last ship, to the last soldier. They don't know how to do anything else. Then teach them, Myra said. You're the commander who started this war. You watched your crew die. You watched your flagship vaporize. You've seen what we can do when we're provoked. Go back to Kithar Prime. Show them the footage. Show them your face. Tell them that humanity isn't asking for surrender. We're offering a choice between existence and extinction. We'll accept a full cessation of hostilities, complete disarmament of offensive fleet assets, and permanent observation posts in Dominion space to ensure compliance. In exchange, we won't reduce your civilization to a cautionary tale. Verk's translator stumbled over the word. Observation posts. You want to occupy us. We want to watch you. There's a difference. Occupations breed resistance. Observation breeds caution. We'll be there in the background, a permanent reminder of what happens when someone pokes the human nest. Your children's children will grow up knowing that their species survived because they learned the lesson, and the galaxy will learn it alongside them. Verk closed his eyes. The pod's life support hummed around him, a thin membrane of survival between his body and the infinite void. He thought about the faces of the boarding party, the ones who'd laughed as they cut down unarmed scientists. He thought about the young analyst Falric, vaporized in the fusion fireball because Verk had chosen to ram a human carrier. He thought about Outpost 7, 800. Soldiers turned to plasma by a rock thrown across interstellar space. If I do this, he said, if I convince them to accept your terms, will you stop? Myra was quiet for a moment. Yes, we'll stop, but you need to understand. Commander, this isn't mercy. This is pragmatism. We don't want to govern a conquered species. We don't want your territory. We want to be left alone. And now you know what happens when we're not left alone. Make sure the rest of the galaxy knows it too. The channel closed. Verica sat in the silence of his pod, the hum of machinery filling his ears like a heartbeat. After a long time, he opened a new channel to the scout vessel and instructed Thrax to set a course for Kithar Prime. He had a message to deliver, and it would be the hardest thing he had ever done, not because it required courage, but because it required him to admit before his entire species that he had been catastrophically, fatally wrong. The Resolute held position near Velaris, its weapons cold, its drones circling it, patient holding patterns. On the bridge, Admiral Ristova watched the long-range sensors and waited. Besides her, Myra Vance stood, motionless, her good hand resting on the tactical console, her eyes never leaving the display. Do you think he'll succeed? Ristova asked. I think you'll try. Whether the high command listens is another question, but it doesn't matter. Myra's voice was distant, almost contemplative. The footage is already spreading through Kithar civilian networks. The families of the soldiers we killed are seeing what happened. The governors are seeing what happened. Even if the high command refuses to surrender, they won't have a fleet to fight with for much longer. Crews will start deserting. No one wants to fight an enemy that doesn't stop, doesn't negotiate, doesn't feel. Ristova raised an eyebrow. Is that who we are now, the enemy that doesn't feel? Myra turned to look at her, and for the first time since the destruction of the Endeavor, something flickered in her gray eyes that wasn't cold calculation. It was grief. Deep, old, barely contained grief that had been shoved into a compartment and sealed shut so she could function. No, Admiral, we feel everything. That's the problem. We feel so much that we had to learn how to shut it off when it became a liability, and once it's off, it's very hard to turn back on. She looked down at her bandaged hand, the one she'd broken to escape her restraints. Maybe when this is over, I'll try, but for now the galaxy needs to see the version of us that can't feel, because that's the version that will keep them from ever doing this again. The sensors chimed, a signal from Kithar Prime, emergency broadcast all channels. The High Command was preparing a statement. Ristova and Myra watched the screen as the Kithar seal appeared, followed by the weathered face of Grand Marshal Zarish. She looked older than she had in any previous transmission, and her voice was heavy with exhaustion. People of the Dominion, by order of the High Council, all offensive fleet operations are suspended effective immediately. We are entering direct communication with the human military command to negotiate terms of cessation. She paused as if the next words were being dragged out of her by force. of unconditional surrender. Rostova let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Myra Vance watched the broadcast for a moment longer, then turned away from the display and walked toward the hatch. "Where are you going?" Rostova asked. "Medical, my shoulder hurts." Myra paused at the threshold, her back to the Admiral, "and after that I'm going to find the families of my crew and tell them what happened. Tell them their people didn't die for nothing. Tell them the lesson was learned." She stepped through the hatch and disappeared into the corridor. Rostova watched her go, then looked back at the tactical display where the Kithar surrender was scrolling across multiple channels. The war was over, the lesson had been taught, and somewhere out in the galaxy, every other species with ambitions of conquest was watching the footage, analyzing the data, and reaching the same conclusion. Do not provoke the humans. They will outlast you. They will outthink you. They will out-endure you. And at the end, when you are broken and desperate, they will offer you terms that feel like mercy but are really just the final surgical incision of a predator that has decided you're not worth the effort of killing, as long as you remember forever that they could. Commander Verk's pod docked with the scout vessel 3 hours later. He stepped aboard, his fur matted, his eyes hollow, and made his way to the communication station. The young Captain Thrax regarded him with a mixture of awe and horror. "Commander, what do we do now?" Verk looked at the star map, at the vast and suddenly fragile seeming expanse of Dominion territory, and answered with the only words that made sense. "We remember, we teach, and we never, ever make this mistake again."